Hi and welcome back to Data Octagon. My name is Goran Cvetanovsky from Hyperight. I will be replacing Robert Luciani for this particular panel. Right now we are discussing data management trends and challenges 2019. Together with us we have three experts from leading organizations from Teradata, Collibra and Confluent. Guys, maybe we can start with a short introduction.
Sure.
Yep.
Niall O'Doherty. I'm responsible for the business consulting within Teradata in EMEA. So not a huge technologist, but more about how businesses get advantage out of data and analytics on a day-to-day basis.
And my name is Steve Neat. I run the sales organization for Collibra in Europe, Middle East and Africa.
And I'm Tom Green. I'm a systems engineer at Confluent. And we're a company that was created by the original founders of the Apache Kafka project, which provides an event streaming platform.
Perfect. So we got a number of questions from the audience, so we will try to go through all of them, but let's see how much time we have. The first one is actually, in your perspective, what are the biggest changes and trends you saw in the past 1 year when it comes to data management, especially from the technology and usability or customer demand point of view? Neil, maybe you can start.
Yeah, great question. I think for Teradata, scale and integration has always been a key part of our value proposition. And what we're seeing over the last year is certainly from our point of view is the decoupling of the storage, the database layer, the other storage layers, and then the analytical tool sets on top. So we're trying to make it much easier for you to build as many data stores as you need, but no more, and have those integrated through to whatever tool or front end the users, whether you're a data scientist or a BI front end, etc. So trying to simplify the overall architecture and make sure that users have access to the data they need when they need it, and that it is stored at the right level of sophistication depending on the value of that data and how it is going to be used in the enterprise. So I think that's where we're seeing the trend. We're trying to make it, we talk a lot about agile, but make it easier for data scientists, easier for the business to get answers, because answers is really what's important, not necessarily the whole technology stack behind it. We want to see companies invest in answers going forward.
So I think what we've seen, and we've heard a lot today about treating data as a valuable asset. And I think if we look back 1, possibly 2 years ago, a lot of organizations and enterprises were really focused on the defensive aspects of that, adhering to regulation and compliance. But and I spent a lot of my time 1, 2 years ago dealing with financial services organizations. But we're seeing a real shift towards any large company that has data wanting to exploit the value of that asset. So moving from defensive use cases, regulations and compliance, much more towards offensive. How do I extract the value out of the data that I've got? And they can only do that if they genuinely know what they've got and they can trust that information. So we're seeing a shift in terms of the industries that we're dealing with and the shift from defense to offense.
I think one of the things we're seeing is a change in the way that businesses are viewing their data and how they view data moving within an organization. So they'll have many technologies in place like Teradata, they'll have analytic systems, they'll have operational systems. And there was, I think, traditionally a view that you would be moving data sets between these systems, maybe with ETL processes and so on. What we're seeing is a move to people viewing a stream of events that move throughout these systems, and it's often the same systems, sometimes there's new systems on board as well. And an event has a lot of business context and business meaning as opposed to purely a data set. So it might be that if you're a retailer, an order was placed. It might be that we need to go and fulfill the stock to replenish our stock. It might be that we need to trigger a delivery van has to go to a particular location. If you're in the finance world, it might be that somebody tried to log in from 4 different countries into a credit card account in a period of time. But these events become very business contextual things. I think seeing that view increasingly where business are viewing the movement of data within an organization as event driven, as a big change. And that is something that some of the high tech companies have done for a long time, people like LinkedIn. We're seeing other businesses want to view themselves in the same way.
Okay. I had actually a question about this, but I want to relay a little bit about this because you mentioned movement of data from defensive to offensive as well. But organizations are still working in some kind of a silos, right? Something that we have tried in the industry to basically find a breakthrough for many years. So how do you see, for example, the opportunity to, for example, let's say data governance, quality, scalability? How can an organization actually reach these goals? Because if you're talking about movement of data, it should be across organization, right?
Yeah, for me, movement obviously is going to occur, but we have to be very careful about moving very large volumes of data because that kind of defeats the whole kind of goal of really moving analytics to the data rather than the data to the analytics. And what we're seeing is as companies start to really scale up and scale out their analytical requirements and capabilities, you really have to start making architectural decisions early on in terms of the value of data and how you're going to store it, where you're going to store it, and not try and duplicate data too much. Moving data, fine. Duplicating lots of data, maybe not so good within an enterprise organization, because the more you duplicate, the more copies of data, the more etc., the more the governance issue starts to come in terms of what is the gold standard, am I looking at the right figure at the right time, and especially as we talked about earlier, as you move towards much more real-time analytics, you have to make sure that you're looking at the latest and the right data and making those decisions based on that data. So I think the kind of the convergence of scale, of real time, and of companies just wanting to get better answers is really what's changing some of these architectural design patterns that we're seeing from our point of view anyway.
And it's a real problem. I heard one of the speakers earlier, CDO from a bank, talk about the 1,000 systems that he had to manage.
Yeah.
So for any person to be able to find the information they need and to be able to understand it and ensure it's consistent is a real challenge. And that's where governance comes into effect, having a single catalog where you can go and shop for your information and know that you're talking the right language, that you've got a common business glossary that everybody understands and approves. So it's a system of record that looks after your critical data, and you can then points you to the right information that's relevant for the business use case.
Yes.
And that is a common problem in all the large organizations that we deal with, that they're wrestling with day in, day out. Getting that ability to know where the data is, but being able to trust it's the right information.
Yes.
It's got ownership, it's got clarity around the definition, and that involves some automation, and it involves people.
Yes.
So making sure that that's available to the business community is really critical.
Good.
I think we see, and actually this plays very interesting into this side of things as well, is that often people will start with early on individual projects where they're wanting to connect different things together, where they want to process more data in real time. Perhaps it's a machine learning project that's out of the innovation lab, is now moving into production, starting to drive fraud checks, for example, and so on. And as it goes through that cycle, you have this view of events, and events being driven and pushed around to the rest of the business. Those events absolutely must have data governance on top of them. Those events, as organizations progress and become more mature in their use of kind of events, those sets of events actually become the source of truth of what is happening within the business. And it potentially ceases to be the state here or the state here in different systems, but the set of events that have happened, the set of orders that have been placed, the set of events that were generated to fulfill and replenish stock, for example. And you absolutely want to make sure that as you're generating those events that you have schemas, structure to that data. It can't be a free-for-all, absolutely no.
I mean, in a way, we're kind of going backwards to go forward. I mean, in the 90s and 2000s, the problem was all around, explosion of data marts, etc. Now we have different technologies, but fundamentally we've built kind of the same problem into it. It's that we have an explosion of lots of different technologies and data stores and unique data structures for particular applications or particular approaches to getting answers. And we just kind of need to go through some kind of consolidation back again so you can see the wood for the trees. You can understand the key events, and not only that, you can combine that event data with the product data or with the customer data that shouldn't really be changing that often. So you have the link to the dynamic as well as the stable data structures in a way that is optimized for the organization. And again, not to keep on about it, but that can scale out and that can really take full advantage of an enterprise view. Because the other thing is, we start looking at IoT, for example, in particular, there's a lot of Internet of Things, so we're looking at just one thing or a small group of things, a production line, but the real value is going to be looking across systems, and across the wider the system, the more likely you are going to see transformational changes happening. So again, that involves lots and lots of different parts of the organization coming together. It includes a breadth of data as well as just a scale out, because just the number of sensors, the number of products, the number of customers is growing all the time, and the amount of data that you're generating from those is growing. So it does really matter that you can handle this volume, that you can handle this throughput from your point of view, that we can handle the governance and make sure that it all makes sense.
Yes. This tied very nicely with the question that I intended at the beginning. And this is, now we have entered this AI economy, right? So all the organizations here today are talking about like being data first, AI first. How do you see the data management or data handling, let's say, developing in the future? Because the data is going to be just more and more, right? IoT connected devices, smart grids, we have like social media, internal data. Organizations are overflowing, and we're just going to have more and more data. So how do we look at that, actually? How this will develop in the future? How we can supply a good data for training these ML AI models?
Well, I think it comes back to treating your data as a valuable asset. And if the data isn't correct, whatever AI and ML you apply to it is just going to give you the wrong answers or the unexpected answers. It staggers me, actually, in going to deal with and work with big companies, that some of the basics are just not there. Having a common understanding of what a customer is sometimes not clear. So getting the basics right, getting the definitions right, knowing what's your trusted information, wherever it may be, then, and only then, I believe, can you start applying AI and ML technologies to it. Otherwise, you're going to end up with biased, skewed, or unexpected outcomes.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of hype, around AI in a way, and big data was the thing, and now AI is kind of the silver bullet, and it's not really the silver bullet. Machine learning has been around before data science even, or before basic analytics was there. It's kind of the origin of computing, and what we're seeing now, though, is with obviously as the price of AI, the price of predictions comes down, it can be applied to a lot more things. Just because it can be applied doesn't mean it should necessarily be applied, is the first thing. And the second thing is that to your point, is unless you can really understand and monitor and control the quality and the inputs, both in the terms of the training sets, also the data inputs that are going to keep going around your model, and the result sets, you're going to really struggle to make sure that you are using your AI models and your predictions in the right way. In other words, that you're doing good for your company or for your products, your customers, rather than actually harming potentially your customers' products, your own reputation, by using models that either you can't prove why the decision was made, you can't audit, customers will lose trust. And I think trust plays a big part in all of our businesses, but it will play an even more important part if your bank loan has been refused because of an AI model. You as the customer need to be able to trust that the inputs were correct in that, and maybe with registration you might be actually even be asking, how did the AI model come to that decision based on my particular data and everyone else's? So you really have to be careful to make sure that you've put in place, again, the foundation that builds up to allow you to build the right models, train the right models, run the right models at scale, and then be able to measure the outputs and make sure you're controlling those models going forward.
I'm certainly seeing, and I did touch on this before, a move from high-tech firms doing machine learning, innovation labs in traditional organizations, that's moving into real use cases and applications. So major credit card companies using machine learning to power their fraud detection and so on. And we're seeing patterns whereby that by having this event view, where they have a persistent set of events, they can play them into their machine learning models. That can be run. They will have several models competing against each other to see which one will provide the best analysis. And the results of that can then be played off in real time. And then furthermore, as they develop new models, because they have a persistent set of things viewed as events, they can replay those events back from the beginning of time into that new model, to validate that new model and the success of it. So they can do things like, for example, check that this new model works in all scenarios. In the fraud case, it may work really well at Christmas time when everyone's at home, but in the holiday season, maybe that particular model doesn't pick up that people are traveling a lot more and might fail. So it allows you to play the events over a much longer period of time and validate models and compare and contrast them against each other. And I think we're seeing people getting to the next stage, not only in terms of actually deploying in production, but starting to see how they can use these models and do more with them by having multiple of them even in some cases.
I mean, I think from a business point of view, I think certainly the executive and the C-suite really have to get their head around what are the implications of building some of these models.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the, like a simple example for, traffic routing, so you see a big traffic jam and you divert people off and you notice, but if you've diverted everyone away, how do you know if the traffic jam is still there? So really what they're doing is they're still sending some of their customers down the wrong path just to see if it's still the wrong path.
Yeah.
And that has an implication, that it just has to be understood in terms of what is the overall, kind of goal that you're trying to achieve as a corporation, as a brand, etc. And make sure that that's understood clearly when you're making your decisions and you're building these models.
And it's challenging because some of those things might happen in real time.
Yes.
And you have to decide in real time whether you're continuing and making sure that things are going down the path that the business has aligned itself to. Yeah.
Okay, so the following question is a little bit more about the strategy and the organization around having a proper data management model, right? Down to the, from the strategy points, so data-driven strategy that will be agile enough to withstand the amounts of data that organizations will get more and more in future by building these models, right? And the second one is the roles and the responsibilities. So to simplify it, what is your recommendation for a best data management strategy, and which roles and responsibilities are the key to make this not only today work, but
I'll have a go if you want. I don't think there's one structure or one recommendation you'd make. What I would say is that there's been a lot of discussion, for example, already today about this kind of pendulum shift away from algorithms and the data science back towards the data management and these kinds of roles. And in my mind, maybe a pendulum shift is the wrong analogy, because that implies that somebody gains and somebody loses. For me, we're moving, if I was to use the analogy, we're moving from individual participations, kind of sports, to like golf, to a soccer team or a football team, as we call it here in Europe. So that to get this right, you need lots of different people in different positions with expertise. You need your data governance experts, you need your data engineers, you need your data scientists still play an absolutely critical role. But you also need these analytics translators, as McKinsey calls them, this bridge between the business and IT. You need the executive sponsors. So we're seeing to build out a good corporate strategy around data and analytics, you need lots of different people, all experts within those roles. Architecture plays a key role, ecosystem as well as analytical architecture, design architecture, UX. All of these functions are needed in the team if you're going to really deliver a world-class kind of analytics operation, so that you can differentiate yourselves from your customers, so that you can, be a company that's taking advantage of these trillions of dollars that are promised through AI, through industrial IoT, through all these kind of technologies. So my view, it's a team sport.
Yes.
I was going to sum it up.
I think 3 years ago when I joined Collibra, I didn't expect to see data on the front page of every newspaper or on the 6 o'clock news. I think we've seen the profile of data become a lot more higher profile in the boardrooms in every company around Europe and around the world. For good reasons and bad, and I suppose GDPR has again raised the profile. So what we're seeing is some companies at a CEO level making a commitment to being data-driven. And that, I think, then makes the investment in the technologies and the people a lot easier to justify. Again, partially defensive in support of some of those regulations, but definitely, how do we turn that data into value? How do we genuinely become a data-driven organization? And we're seeing new roles, such as the Chief Data Officer, building out roles such as data stewards within the organization. And what's key for me is, it is a team sport, but there has to be a lot of focus from the business. Where's the value genuinely coming from? They're the people who know what the data really means, and they're the people who can typically come up with the ideas about where do we extract the value from it. So it's a team sport, but it's just not a architect or IT initiative. It has to span the business and everybody involved.
It needs to serve the business vision.
It has to serve the business, and it will only succeed with the right level of sponsorship in the organisation.
Yes.
So not technology for technology's sake, which we see quite a bit of, unfortunately.
Still, to this day.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the mistakes very soon. Tom, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think a number of years ago, most organizations were operating in a relatively lightweight regulatory environment for data. Now, a handful of organizations like finance organizations, gambling companies and so on, were in a healthcare companies as well, of course, were in a much more tightly controlled regulatory environment for data. GDPR is having to make most organizations have to think about their data in the kinds of ways that some of those much more regulated organizations have had to think about it for quite some time. And that's leading to many organizations having to set up the kinds of roles that we just talked about, CDOs, chief data, that they may not previously have really thought about. So I think not necessarily those organizations, traditional ones in regulated environments, had best practices, but there's a chance now that these other organizations are perhaps thinking about it in a different way and helping to bring some expertise in across the board and improve the way the banks and those other environments are actually doing things too. A bit of innovation in an area that perhaps needed it. Yeah.
So let's talk about the common mistakes that you have seen going around. So I think that becoming data-driven and AI-driven has been a vision for many organizations now for almost 2 years, right? So last year the hype was around machine learning. This year everything is about AI, right? So where do you see the biggest pitfalls or mistakes companies do when thinking like, okay, now we're going to be data-driven, we are enterprise, right? What are the mistakes that they're making when thinking about like the data approach, the data management approach? It's data first, right?
Yeah,
so it should be data first.
Not to contradict you, but I mean this idea that only in the last couple of years have companies taken a data seriously or data management, data-driven approach. If you look back to kind of Walmart and its starting point and how back in the 80s and 90s it talked about how its success wasn't because it opened lots of stores, it was because it replaced inventory with data. You look at eBay, you look at lots of different organizations that have been incredibly data-driven over the last 20 plus years. And so in a way, it's not that it's suddenly new that data management is important. It has always been important to some companies, and those tend to actually be companies that outperformed their peers in the last 10, 20, 30 years. I think it's got a renewed value because of what we discussed earlier, the GDPR, because AI is now seen as a hot topic, and because companies are beginning to understand I can't do AI unless I have really fixed my data problems. So I think some companies are still ahead because they've always taken data management seriously, and they've always built out scalable architectures and approaches to data management. I think others are now coming on board and suddenly realizing, you know what, this actually does matter and that we better take it seriously, because the mistakes are that they haven't traditionally taken it seriously. They're very siloed and stovepiped, that they've allowed every function, every team, every group to have their own, whether it's Excel under the desk right up to their own servers and systems. And in a way, we might touch on it later, that the cloud provisioning has almost made that easier. It's made it cheaper and easier to do that, and we run the risk of not learning from history and just spinning up every time we want something, spinning up something new, and digging ourselves further down that hole of, again, not having a governance strategy, not having an understanding of where the data sits and what's the right data, not having a proper architecture around streaming, etc., and just building complexity. So complexity, in my mind, is what kills organizations from a data and analytics point of view. If they keep adding complexity, they get to a point where literally they can't see the wood for the trees, and they've lost kind of direction and strategy. So for me, it's about simplification. It's about going back to some of the core data management principles that really haven't changed in the last 20, 30 years. And yes, using new technologies, yes, using new approaches, yes, using new architectures to deliver that, but going back to those fundamental kind of ideas of, just building what's needed and no more in a way.
I will have to probably rephrase a bit. We are discussing not digital-born companies. We're talking about enterprises with the complexity, large complexity, multi-layered type of technologies used for data storage, analytics, and everything else. And one comment, 2 years ago, Patrick Ekemo, he was at that point working in CSM, he said like, we know more about the value, the cost, and the usability of the chairs and the inventory that we have in our offices, but we don't have the same for the data. So until the data becomes a part of the financial sheet on the end of the year, you will never know what is the value of data.
Yeah. Yeah.
But coming back to the same, so we are discussing enterprises that are, you know, multi-layered technology, complexity, and etc.
And I think the biggest pitfall that we see is an expectation and belief that this can be solved with technology alone. Just throwing more technology at it, and that by waving a magic wand, some technology will go out there and find every bit of data that you've got, classify it, bring it all back. But can you imagine if all it did was brought back 800 columns that say customer?
Yeah.
What is the business is worse off then? So which one do I go to trust it? What is the definition that I should use? So governance, in our mind, is technology, yes, but it's people and process with equal measure. So it's about change management, is those new roles, setting expectations. I was with a customer a couple of weeks back, and there were some subtleties involved with this. They're not very happy using the word data owner, because it has this concept of somebody protecting that that information, whereas they want it to be used by the business. So by changing that role, they've called it a data hero, somebody who can take responsibility for it, but also set it free and make it available to the rest of the organization. So the people aspects shouldn't be underestimated.
Tom?
And I think in terms of, you know, potential mistakes made, I think to the point you raised there about, you know, potentially at very senior levels, people realizing now after a few years, this is something they need to do. That can lead to a sense of urgency. We need to do this now, top down, everyone needs to get involved with this. I think it's also important to bear in mind that sometimes you can't run before you can walk as well, right? And for sometimes, even though you want to and need to change the organization, both in terms of people, technology sometimes, choices and so on as well, sometimes you do need to pick something within the organization that's going to be the first target to pick off. Yeah. And from that experience, learn what it means for your organization, your people, what skills they're going to need from that specific project and set of teams. You can then, okay, now we've learned from this, now we can start to build a company-wide architecture, company-wide decision-making on this. So I think there's always the risk of, when there's a sense of urgency, everyone wants to go for it at once, and there is a learning process to go through as well, and sometimes it's better to make the mistakes on a thing, learn, and then say, right, we've learned from this, now we can go big.
And fundamentally, AI, machine learning, these types of technologies will undoubtedly change companies' businesses fundamentally. And if you're just trying to use them to kind of improve your existing process, you may be going again down a path of waste and of destruction. If you think about it differently and open it up to this kind of, how could we potentially use this to change our business, our industry, you know, just like Walmart did, just like eBay did, just like these kind of companies did, then you're in a different kind of discussion, and that takes leadership, really, not just management, it just takes leadership.
And I'd add to that, it's, as you said, top-down, prioritizing where the value is. You can't do it for 1,000 systems, as we heard earlier from the CDO of a bank. You have to define where the maximum value is and where your critical data elements are, and then do that completely, learn from it, and move on. Governing data is not a 6-week project. It's a lifetime's work. You never stop doing it. But you have to start somewhere. Deliver some value, make it visible to the business, and roll it out from there. Walking first, and then you can run.
Good. One final question, and this is basically coming from our delegates, and this is on-premise versus cloud. Okay. So key differences, benefits, risks. Any comments?
I would just summarize by saying the trend is towards cloud. You see it everywhere. Even some of the most traditional organizations that we deal with, banks, etc., are moving towards cloud. So I don't see that changing anytime soon.
I would say I don't think it's an or question, on-premise or cloud. I think it's an and question. I think you're going to end up with hybrid architectures. And the other interesting thing that I'm beginning to see is as the CFO office starts to get involved in some of these discussions,
yes,
there's a realization that these costs are potentially spiraling and non-predictable, two things that CFOs really don't like. So I think we're going to see, cloud obviously has a huge advantage in terms of agility, etc. But companies just need to be careful how they deploy that and how they manage that and ensure that they're doing it for the right reasons and that they're getting what they need out of it rather than just thinking it's going to be this. It is the default new way of doing things. So, I think
there needs to be a backup.
Yeah, I mean, a CIO once jokingly with me, I said, "How's it going?" He said, "Great, we've got the cloud rolled out. I basically can sit in my office and everything's managed out there in the infrastructure. I don't have to do anything, etc. But I'm waiting any day now the CFO is going to come on my door and not kill me and tell me to go back to managing and back to doing my job because, we need to make sure that we also control the costs and that we have control of our architecture that works best for what you're ever trying to do within your organization." So I don't think it's a black and white kind of just question. No. We could spend probably 2 hours talking cloud alone, but I think somewhat hybrid.
Hybrid. Good. Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. On-premise is not going away, especially for the large traditional organizations with still running very traditional hardware platforms for some of them. I think that there obviously is clearly a trend towards cloud. And I think regardless of whether that is a move where you're going and you're going to get there or whether you continue to run in a hybrid environment, in both cases, from a technology point of view, one of the key things, how do you bridge your data between those two things? So that how do you have the data that's on premise? How do you ensure that you can send information about those processes and systems into the cloud to be processed there? And how do you send results and so on and decisions made in the cloud and communicate them back again? And again, I always come back to this event view that you may send events about trade data if you're a trading bank, investment bank, to the cloud. You may run certain things processing on there. Maybe you use that compute for doing your end of day calculations, risk. You need to share data between them and you need to have a way of processing and bridging that. So that's going to be a critical part of those architectures.
Good. Well, I want to thank you all for being here today. Let's continue the discussion, of course, at the event as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.